Ms. Simmons?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Good morning. We hear your verdict, and we appreciate you fulfilling your role as a check on the government in the first phase of this trial. We want to acknowledge the suffering that Jennifer Fulford went through and the pain that her family continues to live. This second phase of the trial is very different. And despite the horrific crime that Mr. Nelson committed, this case does not warrant the death penalty. Now, capital punishment is not reserved simply for the worst of the worst, as we frequently say, but for the most aggravated and least mitigating of cases. So far, you've heard most of the aggravation that applies to this case, but you have not yet heard the lifelong history of abuse and mental illness suffered by Mr. Nelson. Our system is meant to balance the value of justice with the balance of mercy. That's why we've been talking about balancing aggravators and mitigators since the beginning of jury selection. The death penalty isn't designed simply for the most shocking of crimes. The system requires that mercy temper justice. Before considering the death penalty, you must know the person that you are called upon to judge. You must consider his individual circumstances. Now, Mr. Nelson's individual circumstances include an abusive and later absent father, a schizophrenic mother, abusive older brothers, decades of alcohol and drug abuse, and as you heard last week, almost 25 years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, most of which was served in solitary confinement. He has been diagnosed with severe mental illness, has cognitive impairments from brain damage and other medical issues. All of these problems affected his ability to make rational decisions. And in September of 2017, his mental illness combined with his homelessness, his helplessness, and his emptiness put him in the position that we find ourselves today. It is now our hope to show you how Scott Nelson got to this point. Now, Ms. Fulford's death was a tragedy, it's an injustice, and Mr. Nelson is responsible. Nothing that we present to you over the next week or so is intended to reduce either her tragedy or Mr. Nelson's responsibility for it. Scott Nelson was born in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1964. He was the youngest of 3 boys, and you will hear that his older 2 brothers were much older than him. His brother Jim was about 8.5 years older, and his brother Bob was about 7.5 years older. It was apparent that he was an accidental child, and his parents reminded him of that throughout his childhood. His family appeared normal from the outside, but you'll see that it was anything but normal. His mother, Joan Nelson, was mentally ill and hospitalized many times during Mr. Nelson's youth. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She endured electroshock therapy. She was prescribed heavy psychotropic medication that often made her sedated and unavailable. When Scott was born, Joan and Scott did not come straight home from the hospital. Joan was placed in a mental institution, and Scott went to live with a maternal aunt. You'll hear that that aunt already had 3 small children, and that Scott did not receive the attention that he required as a newborn. And that lasted for several months until his mother came home. Scott's father, Larry Nelson, has been described as a narcissist, an alcoholic, an abuser, a womanizer, and having a rage bubbling just under the surface that was constantly present. Larry had been arrested for a robbery spree in his late teens, but he was pardoned by a connected relative. During Scott's childhood years, Larry was physically, verbally, emotionally abusive to his mother and his brothers and him. You'll hear that Scott witnessed a lot of physical abuse towards his mother, towards his brother Jim, and towards his brother Bob. Jim will describe for you incidents where Larry beat him with belt buckles and 2x4s. You'll hear that 7-year-old Scott witnessed his father throw a hammer at Bob, narrowly missing his face. And Jim Nelson will tell you that the abuse tapered off as the boys got older and bigger than Larry Nelson. Given the age difference between them, this time period coincides with Scott coming into his elementary school years when he would start to be abused by Larry. Jim will tell you that Scott witnessed the abuse, but seemed to get less of the physical abuse than his brothers and his mother. Since Scott wasn't as physically abused by his father, the boys assumed he was the favorite son. And as Scott moved into his preteen years, he came to associate love with the lack of abuse instead of kindness and affection. He was constantly trying to ingratiate himself in his father's life, trying to pick up the same pastimes, just so he could spend time with him. But Larry wasn't any more of a father to Scott than he was to the other two brothers. The emotional and mental abuse continued. His father never showed affection or taught his sons anything that parents should pass on to their children. And witnessing these acts from such a young age had a profound effect on Scott. He grew resentful towards his father for the abuse that he inflicted upon his mother. But he also confusedly tried to win over his affection. He pretended to like sports so he could go and watch baseball with Larry. He pretended to like fishing so he could go on day trips with Larry. But his father continued to abuse his mother and was indifferent to the effect it was having on Scott. One incident was especially damaging to young Scott. You'll hear that when Scott was young, he often slept in his mother's bed with her. That his mother and father had twin beds in the same bedroom, and that one night Larry came home, forced Joan to have sex with him in her bed, mere feet from where Scott was pretending to be asleep. Scott's cousin Tom Broderick will share with you how different his own father was from Larry. He noticed that the Nelson boys were afraid of their father. He noticed when they lit up when his own father spent time with them. And even though Tom was a child at the time as well, he could tell that there was something wrong within the Nelson family. Now, Larry Nelson, I mentioned, was a narcissist. He was overly concerned with what others thought of him, often to the detriment of his own family. Larry was a good provider in terms of a home, money, food. But again, he did nothing to enrich the lives of his wife and children. He never spent time with his sons, never taught them anything about life in general. Meanwhile, he frequently built tree houses for other neighborhood kids, went on Boy Scout trips despite his own sons not participating. And Scott's brothers were clearly affected by this abuse as well, and they abused Scott in turn. There were times where Bob physically beat Scott, leaving him with a black eye that neighbors noticed. He locked him in a hope chest on a couple of occasions inside the basement. And Jim would often tie up Scott, make him look like a hostage victim, like some kind of game or a joke. Scott would view that as spending time with his older brother, but Jim was 19 at the time and Scott was 11. At one point, Scott was lured into the woods by an older neighborhood boy, beaten with a rubber hose, leaving welts all over his body. And when he came home, his parents barely batted an eye. Nothing was done about the beating, and 7-year-old Scott was left to dress his own wounds. These are just examples of the constant abuse that Mr. Nelson went through. And in the midst of this abuse, his family moved from Massachusetts to rural New Hampshire, further isolating him from any hope of an outside influence that was positive on his life. When Scott was 9 years old, Larry lost his job under dubious circumstances. And he moved the family to Danbury, New Hampshire, which is a very small town. They bought a country store, but Larry spent most of his time hunting and fishing, going on Boy Scout trips, probably having affairs as well. And that left Joan to run the store, and left the boys to fend for themselves. You'll hear that they often had to find and make their own dinner, that there was no expectation of them. And during this time, his older brother, Jim Nelson, did not live with them much longer. He had just graduated high school and was trying to get out of the house as quickly as he could. He spent the summer traveling, took some classes, and the next brother, Bob, was also not around. He was off making his own friends, using drugs. And there weren't many kids Scott's own age. Again, I mentioned that Danbury is a small town. It's now a hotbed of the opioid crisis. But in the 70s, Scott was hanging out with older boys and led to alcohol and marijuana first. and cocaine in his 20s. You'll hear that Scott first began using alcohol and marijuana at age 13. Now, shortly after moving to New Hampshire, the store folded, and Larry began a custom home building business. He built a home for his family, and he was working on a home down the street for neighbors. During that, he began an affair with a neighbor who was married. Her name was Betty. She had 2 boys of her own. Scott discovered the affair when his father picked him up and had Betty in the front seat with his arm around her. Scott and Bob came up with an elaborate scheme to get Larry caught in the act so that their mother would find out. They put sugar in his gas tank and left him stranded. This type of revenge scenario was something that Joan had taught the boys growing up. She'd often do little tricks on Larry, just something that was deniable, that you wouldn't get caught for or beaten for. Scott remembers being in his mother's room as a child and her making little noises to wake up Larry in the middle of the night. She encouraged the boys to place heavy objects above the door frame so they'd fall on him when he came through. They destroyed a precious Boy Scout heirloom that was important to Larry. These were just little ways that the family could get back at the man who tortured them. But Scott was 12 when his parents divorced, and that resulted in an almost complete abandonment by Larry. It left Scott and his mother destitute. They were able to live in that custom home for a few more months, but eventually had to resort to burning furniture for heat. And then they moved out and into a trailer in a trailer park. Joan had to get a job for the first time, which left Scott alone most of the time at age 12. He went to school and hung out with older boys in the neighborhood, and some of them, like Clifford Benson, who you'll meet, were good influences on Scott. They played music or hockey, hang out at each other's houses. Cliff noticed Joan's mental illness. He described her as bipolar, happy and nice one minute and raging the next. She'd yell at the boys for knocking on the door to see if Scott could come out and play. And Cliff would notice when Scott stayed home to take care of his mother, saying she was having a bad day and he's not coming out. At this point, Scott became like a caretaker or a spouse to his mother. His brothers were away, his father was away, and it was just the 2 of them in this trailer. She was leaning on him in ways inappropriate for a mother to lean on her young teenage son. She would share with him intimate details of her life. She would ask how she looked in certain outfits when she'd leave the house. She would walk around the house in a sheer nightgown. And she also puts pressure on Scott to support her financially and emotionally. Jim recalls one summer in high school, when Scott was in high school, and saved up money to buy a car that he was very proud of, only to sell it 2 months later because Joan needed the money. But Joan was all he had. Scott felt responsible for her. He was always doing everything he could to take care of her, doing everything he could to keep her from losing it and being hospitalized again. This was a lot of pressure on a teenager who's trying to figure out his own life and trying to keep his mother out of a mental institution. And the threat that child services would always step in was constant as well. Now, in Scott's early adulthood, he worked in restaurants and car dealerships, but he never could hold a job for very long. He got bored easily and could always find a new one. He had several short-term relationships, but none that lasted over a year. His alcoholism and drug abuse were contributing to his lack of stability. He was in several car accidents, he had a few DUIs, he just couldn't get on his feet. And so in 1994, Scott Nelson made a decision that changed his life. He went to his father for help. He asked him if he could stay with Larry, and Larry said no. He asked him if he could borrow some camping equipment, and Larry said no. Scott ended up stealing $10,000 and a car from Larry and taking it across state lines. He was charged federally, and his father pressed charges against him. Family members felt like Scott had finally unleashed the years of terror that his father had put upon his mother and him. And Tom remembers hearing that Scott told Larry, "You'll never hurt Mom and me again." Because of the amount of money taken from Larry's bank account, Scott was charged with serious federal offenses. and he was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He was transferred to various penitentiaries all over the country and was unable to receive visits from family members for that length of time. He also wasn't held in correctional institutions, which would have provided some kind of rehabilitation, mental illness treatment, substance abuse treatment. He did not receive that. Instead, Scott spent most of his time in solitary confinement, known as the Special Housing Unit, which you'll hear more about. Scott often found himself in trouble with other inmates because he had a habit of reporting minor rule violations to correctional officers. He had a reputation of being a narc or a tattletale. And he even testified against a cellmate of his who had confessed a murder to him. He was flown to Nevada, testified against Sean Kane, who was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. So solitary became a unique problem for Scott. On the one hand, he wanted it. It's the only place he felt safe. He didn't belong to any gang or group that could protect him. He doesn't have any tattoos. He often didn't get along with groups in particular because of verbal disagreements and his reputation as a narc. He suffered physical abuse and was raped by a cellmate. He suffered PTSD from the abuse that he suffered as a child and in prison. But at the same time, solitary confinement was taking its toll on Scott's fragile mental health. He became hypervigilant, a sign of PTSD. He lost privileges due to segregation, like time out of his cell. So in the prison records, there are times where Scott asked not to be in solitary confinement, wanting to try to be in general population, wanting to try to work in the prison. And there were other times where he was asking for it for his protection, even going through lengths to commit minor violations to make sure that he stayed in solitary. Overall, Scott spent about 19 years in solitary confinement due to either administrative segregation for his safety or disciplinary segregation for minor prison violations. His time in solitary confinement further exacerbated his mental illness and his lack of coping mechanisms. He became institutionalized, by which I mean his time of incarceration created deficits in social and life skills. Clinical psychology recognizes that people who have been incarcerated for long periods of time, who haven't had responsibilities or independence, haven't had to make decisions of their own, often become unable to manage the regular demands of everyday life upon their release. Studies have shown that institutionalization can compound mental illness. So when Scott was released from that original sentence in 2010, he only made it 11 days before finding himself arrested again. He found himself back in federal prison for 7 more years, back in solitary confinement for most of that time as well. And in April of 2016, Scott suffered a perforated colon that required surgery outside of the prison and a temporary colostomy bag that was to last 6 weeks. Unfortunately, he was never taken for that colostomy reversal surgery, and he lives with it today. He spent another 8 months in prison before he was offered early release to a halfway house. But upon his last release in May of 2017, he was pushed out the front door and told to check in to probation in downtown Orlando. During the next few months, Scott tried to get his life back in order. He had no ID, he had trouble finding a job and a place to live. He spent some time living at the Orlando Rescue Mission, and he eventually found a job as a painter. He was able to stay in the office when the owner took him in. But as you heard, his federal probation officer scared his employer, got him kicked out and on the streets again. And during that month of September, Scott was living on the streets, trying to manage his colostomy while homeless, turning back to his addictions. His PTSD, his depression, his institutionalization, his lack of coping skills, and stress of everything culminated into a storm that led to this tragedy. And again, none of this has been offered as an excuse for the horrible crimes he committed. None of it is a justification. None of it is an attempt to blame others. It's merely meant to show the mental state of Mr. Nelson leading up to this crime. It's the mental state that was the culmination of a lifelong series of abuse and mental injury. Scott's life has been one of abandonment and isolation. When he was 9 and his family moved from Massachusetts to New Hampshire, he was cut off from his maternal side of the family, never to see them again. They didn't visit, family didn't visit them. Then Jim moves out, and he doesn't see him as often. When he was 12 and his parents divorced, Scott was cut off from the paternal side of his family, never to see those cousins or relatives again either. He saw his father only occasionally so that Larry could keep up the appearances of being a good father. But Larry was no father to Scott. Instead, Larry moved to Vermont, married Betty, raised her 2 sons. He cut off ties with his own sons, eventually even writing them out of his own will. Scott's time in solitary confinement further complicated his mental illness. He's been diagnosed with PTSD, depression, bipolar disorder, possible autism spectrum, cognitive deficits, and dysexecutive syndrome. All of these affect his ability to make rational decisions. That compounded with homelessness, helplessness, emptiness he found himself in. Scott wasn't lying when he said, "I died that night," in his confession to police. Scott is a person who is well-suited and easily housed in prison. You will see that he had no major issues in his 25 years of incarceration. After all he's been through, he's unable to make it on the streets, and he will never get the chance to try again. He was damaged as a child by mental illness and abuse in his home. He was damaged by substance abuse in his 20s. He was damaged in his 30s, 40s, and 50s by solitary confinement and incarceration. Scott Nelson will die in prison. You decide whether he dies of natural causes or at an execution by the state of Florida. We would ask you to grant mercy and choose life.